Unions in first world countries, or the imperial countries, whatever you want to call them, are highly incentivized to support imperialism and thus mostly do. And if you are against imperialism, you should seriously think about which unions you are joining, and perhaps even consider not joining one at all. Me saying this is going to be something that will make a lot of you quite uncomfortable. Your immediate reaction will be you thinking, hey, but isn't the common knowledge, like, join a union #1 on the list of the things that people tell you what to do if you want to be like a leftist or whatever? And yeah, it is something that a lot of people say, but it's also an incredibly simplistic thing, because most people don't actually think about what unions are aside from, well, they're just like groups of workers organizing together for the greater good or whatever, but they're not actually that. It's significantly more complicated. And when you think more about what unions actually are, you analyze what they do and the effects of it, it becomes pretty clear that unions in of themselves are not really any sort of pathway to anti-imperialist or even at all revolutionary politics. And in many respects, they can actually be detrimental to such goals or even directly work against them. So that's what we're going to be talking about here. So there was recently a hubbub on Twitter caused by a bunch of American people being confronted with the notion of what I'm talking about here for the very first time. And they all had this immediate, emotional reaction, pure defensiveness, upon hearing about something that really isn't much of a controversial thing if you have ever engaged in material analysis before, and that is that an organization like a union that is specifically made from a subset of workers is going to exist to further the interest of its members. And if the interests of its members come into conflict with that of, say, other groups of workers, even other unions, or, say, people in the third world who face imperialism, which people in said union happen to derive some sort of benefit from, then they are, by and large, going to pursue those interests regardless of those facts. So we're going to be using as an illustrative example here the complaints of YouTuber Dead Domain to me just saying that sort of thing. And we're going to use this as a bit of a teaching moment to talk about this in an environment that is much more conducive to it, because I already invited this person on to actually talk about it live. Of course, they were not willing to. People like this prefer to remain in a Twitter hug box where they can just feel good about getting more likes or whatever, based on their own willful and malicious misinterpretation of what you're saying from other people with the same position as them in the imperialist world system, who also have the exact same immediate emotional reaction to seeing this sort of thing for the first time. There's no desire to learn, there's no desire to discuss anything, there's no desire to improve the world or to educate people. It's all just sort of a desire to protect one's own feelings above all else. And people like this generally operate in an environment where they don't have to actually even think about people outside the first world at all. This is someone who makes videos about pop culture, anime, bullshit like that doesn't really have any bearings on the real world. It's not someone who ever thinks about the victims of imperialism. She's actually someone who would very much rather not hear about it, given what she's indicated in her replies to me on this matter. So her first tweet was saying, "Sure seems like bad empanada doesn't believe in anything except suffering." And this is in response to a tweet where I said, "Don't join a union. Unions exist purely to gain benefits for their members at the cost of everyone else if needed. In the first world, this means at the cost of the third. Your union will suck imperialist cock for a 1-cent raise." Now this is actually just true. I'm going to be elaborating on this throughout this video, but I've already given you the crux of how and why this actually happens, the basics of it. She does not actually respond to that notion. She doesn't even try, nor does she actually do so in any of her subsequent responses to me, as you'll be seeing. And then I made a joke tweet follow-up to that, which she took genuine offense to, where I said the world will be better with first world suffering. Now, taking offense at people saying something like that at the expense of you as a first worlder in the imperial core is just very Zionist coded. It's very, well, what about the Israeli feelings? It's like the sort of white British people who get genuinely offended and angry when they see E-Up Lovely making posts where he jokes about putting white English into camps. You would not be offended by this sort of thing genuinely unless you think that as a first world white person, having your class position, your position in the imperial world system, analyzed in a way that is ultimately correct, unless you feel emotionally targeted, you feel personally targeted, you feel like you're being morally judged and you're being made to feel defensive because of this. Because there's nothing really controversial about what I'm saying here, unless you just deny material reality. And wanting so desperately to take a joke like this seriously, genuinely being offended on it, it's like being offended at being called a cracker. There's functionally no difference here in the degrees of that, except I guess because cracker tends to come from, racialized people in the first world who are of closer proximity for you, it's easier to understand where that sort of joke, supposed racial slur is coming from than it is when it's someone who is making a joke at your expense, specifically making reference to your position in the imperialist world system, which you seem very bothered by that being acknowledged. So I responded to this tweet because frankly, it's just embarrassing that there are YouTubers who pertain to be like representatives of the left who have never heard of this sort of thing before, who need to have like the most basic analysis of the class position of people in the first world and what things like their representative organizations tend to do in certain circumstances. They need to have that explained to them because they've just never heard of it before. So I said, if the idea that first world unions exist to further the interests of their members, for whom imperialism is actually a boon, is at all new or novel to you, it's because you're just very stupid. Yeah, that's true. And I followed it up with, this is all very basic stuff, and it's kind of shocking how many of you have never thought about this before, or you just don't care, which is almost certainly more likely. There's a reason why your unions have done literally nothing to impede this genocide, nor the previous 50. Yeah, this is just sort of uncontroversially true. In very rare occasions, individual unions do take action against imperialism. For example, Italian dock workers recently blocked arms shipments to Israel. But as a bloc, unions do not do that. The unions who do that are an exception in the same way that someone like Frederick Engels was an exception among the bourgeois class in his genuine advocacy for the rights of workers and for communism. The general tendency, the general material interests of first world unions is to support imperialism, or at least to ignore it, just as the general tendency of the bourgeoisie is to further their own interests and to hurt the working class. That's not a moralistic judgment of any of these people. It's simple material analysis of how people tend to be motivated primarily by their own selfish interests. And what we want to do as people who are against imperialism, or at least if this person was against imperialism, which I do not think she genuinely is at all, which would explain why she never talks about it on her channel, you would be talking about these things and you would be agreeing with me and you'd be telling people, yeah, and this is what we need to overcome. We need to talk about these incentive structures and we need to overcome them, or at least do something so that the people who live at the expense of people in the third world are forced into action out of their own selfish interests. Now, Dead Domain ignored these two posts and instead decided to quote tweet another follow-up joke post saying unlimited genocide in the first world. This is a joke! You ignore the argument to complain about a joke because you feel genuinely offended by a joke. Like, this is, as I said, it's like someone being offended by like someone following up their argument with, and you're a cracker or something, and then using that as an excuse to just avoid the whole argument. She says it's so funny for people to take these kinds of positions to criticize others because you don't actually believe this. You don't believe it's possible or going to happen, because if you did, you wouldn't just be making YouTube videos about it. I made posts preceding that we just went over, where I explained my position. You could have responded to those. You could have attempted to refute those, but you didn't. Instead, you once again focus on the follow-up joke at your expense as a privileged white first worlder. I'm not going to apologize to you for that, and the fact that you take offense at that at all, rather than just being like, okay, whatever, that's very weird. You should not be getting offended by that if you're against imperialism. You should not be getting offended by people making jokes at the expense of your position in the imperialist world system. Just like a white person who is anti-racist should not get offended at being called a cracker. And her follow-up to me, calling her out for intentionally avoiding my actual argument to focus on a follow-up joke, is extremely revealing. She said, "Your material analysis has the depth of a thimble and basically boils down to, was someone born in an imperial country, then they should suffer and die." That's her interpretation of me saying that unions in the first world exist to further the interests of their members, for whom imperialism is actually a boon. That's her reaction to that. It's like saying, what, so you want me to die? This is one of the most Israeli coded things I've ever seen. It's like when you say, oh, Palestinians are people. Palestinians should have the right of return. And an Israeli comes along and says, what? You want me to just die? You want them to kill me? You're advocating for my genocide? This is the exact same thing, coming from the exact same place. What this is someone who is being made to feel uncomfortable because she takes this as a moral judgment of her as a person. And, she really would rather not have to think about the imperialist world system that benefits her and others like her. Now, this is precisely why I'm here. I want to make you uncomfortable. I want to make you think about these things that you don't usually think about. Because otherwise, you're never going to do anything about them. Because otherwise, you'd keep making videos about dumb pop culture shit. And your viewers would never, ever even be exposed to these sorts of very basic and true ideas that you are made uncomfortable by. What I'm saying is making you conscious of your position in the global imperialist system. It's making you think about the way that you act within it, about how the things that you take for granted as being good might not actually be as good as you thought they were. You know, like joining a union without thinking much about it. It might make you uncomfortable. You might have this immediate reaction where you're just like, what? You want to kill me because you said maybe I should think before joining a union? But it's still right. And you'll only ever have the potential to take action against that if you are conscious of it. Those of you who have material interests, selfish interests, that are misaligned with those of the global majority need to be pushed to taking action for everyone else, in spite of you doing so, potentially not being exactly in your own material interests, at least in the short term. And I'm glad to make you uncomfortable, make you think about these things, and help even a little bit to contribute to that goal. So let's get into a bit of a broader discussion here of like what unions are and why they are incentivized to operate in this way, and provide like some actual examples or hypotheticals or whatever of what I'm talking about here. So unions are basically things that cropped up to advocate for the rights, the workers' rights of their members in the capitalist system in the 19th, 18th centuries. They initially cropped up in the First World, which is where capitalism originally developed, before expanding to the rest of the world as capitalism spread there. Initially, most workers in the countries where capitalism originally developed had very similar interests, most industrial workers I mean. So they had this tendency to found big unions that everyone was in. Like the International Workers of the World, for example, is a great example of that. They were once an extremely prominent union that has now fallen out of prominence. Over time, however, unions splintered more and more into more specialized unions, like individual workplace unions or individual industry unions or regional unions for individual industries and stuff like that. Because ultimately, the role of a union is not to advocate for the working class as a whole, and it's certainly not to advocate for the global working class as a whole. It's rather to derive as much benefits as possible for its members and nothing else. So the evolution of these unions into more narrow unions that can focus more and more on a specific group of people was a very natural thing. And that's sort of the status that unions are in today. We have a bunch of smaller unions that are like a part of a bigger organization, but these unions are ultimately quite independent and ultimately are each narrowly focused on certain subsets of people working. It also bears mentioning that most unions, in fact, basically all unions in the First World, have been captured by the state to serve its interests, and they have for a very, very long time. And this makes joining them, even if you do benefit for them, something that you should, at least put some thought into before you do so, even more. The state has very successfully captured and regulated labor organizing all throughout the world, mostly in the First World, though most effectively in the First World, though I mean. And yeah, that's something that you also need to be considering when we're talking about this here, especially because it directs unions even more towards being complicit in or outright advocating for imperialism. But anyway, so the way that unions sort of broke down into these smaller and smaller unions advocating for an increasingly more narrow group of people is that this creates a ton of different conflicts between different groups of workers who are all in different unions, different industries, who are all advocating primarily for themselves rather than as a cohesive bloc. And this inevitably means that they are going to advocate for imperialism when it benefits them. And at the very least, most of them have no real incentive to be against imperialism, because it's only in like the very long term where like the entire capitalist system would be abolished and communism would be established that they would really benefit from fighting imperialism. And, that probably doesn't seem very realistic to many people, or they probably don't even know about that as a concept. So it's simply way less risky and more beneficial for them to uphold the capitalist system that if you are a member of like one of the big first world unions is actually pretty good for you. Obviously, you're still working for someone else. They're still profiting off your labor, but you are not badly off at all. There's a concept in Marxist theory, originally developed by Friedrich Engels and later developed further by Vladimir Lenin, called the labor aristocracy. When Lenin spoke about this, he spoke about it in the framework of the imperialism of his time. Lenin didn't think that every worker in the imperial countries was a member of the labor aristocracy. He rather thought that there was a narrow subset of the workers in the imperialist countries who had joined unions that advocated for their own narrow subset of interests and derived really nice benefits from this, and that because of this, they no longer shared the same interest as the rest of the proletariat, not just in the world, but also often in their own countries. Now, since Lenin's time, imperialism has evolved quite a bit, and, the global economic relations and social relations have evolved quite a bit. And a lot of the lower tier jobs that Lenin would not have considered to make someone a part of the labor aristocracy have increasingly been more and more outsourced from the first world to the third, or whatever you want to call it, the global south. And this has resulted in a situation where more and more people in the first world could be considered a part of this labor aristocracy that no longer has the same self-interest as other workers in other places of the world. You know, think of like a member of like the United Auto Workers, a union that gets really great benefits for its members. You know, like what, $35 an hour working in an auto plant. Fucking sick. That person doesn't really have the same interests as, say, a laborer working in a cobalt mine in the Congo. These people inhabit two basically entirely alien worlds. They have totally different interests. To imagine them as a part of the same interest group, the same reductive interest group like the global proletariat, is an absurdity. In fact, it makes more sense to imagine their interests in conflict. The people in that United Auto Workers Union, in fact, in many ways, rely on the exploitation of that person and others like him to have that position that they're in, to have that great union job with great benefits and an abundance of consumer products to spend their disposable income on. The members of that union have a clear material incentive not to advocate for that person. That is unions, in a nutshell, benefiting from imperialism and thus being moved towards advocating for it. That's how it works. And that's why you can't take for granted this off-sided phrase of just join a union, unless what you're looking for is just, getting benefits for yourself, getting benefits for other people working in the same industry, or even sometimes just the same workplace as you. If that's what you want, then yes, join a union. But if you have a broader political goal, a broader political project that you are interested in furthering, you might want to put a little bit more forward into that decision rather than just joining a union. In fact, you joining that union might harm that broader political project that you believe in. And this doesn't even just go for imperialism, it also goes for like labor relations within a country like the US itself. Let me provide some examples here. Police unions. Everyone hates police unions. Everyone understands that police unions just really brazenly exist to advocate for benefits for their members and protection of their members at the expense of pretty much everyone else. The thing is, that's also what most other unions also do. It's just not quite as obvious because, the other unions aren't advocating for the fucking cops. And that's why you gotta be really careful when just like lionizing unions uncritically, as people in the first world often do. And I'm not even talking about this just in regards to imperialism. I mean, in general, unions are not really revolutionary organizations, at least not anymore. They might have been 100 years ago, but they certainly are not now. Because if a union gets its members enough benefits from the system that they no longer think that it's worth fighting the system, then why the fuck would they do so, Why would they take that risk on behalf of others who aren't in as good of a position as they are? You have to understand a union as what it actually is. A narrow grouping of people advocating for their own interests. Nothing more, nothing less. When you start idolizing them, if you think of them as anything more than that, you're incorrect. Unions can be part and parcel to broader political projects, but this really does not happen except in cases when they're advocating for their own interests at the same time. And this really mostly happens in the third world. Think of like the Coca Growers Union in Bolivia, for example, which became an incredibly important part of the socialist government there. But they didn't do that out of the goodness of their heart. They did that because doing so benefited their members. It really is that simple. Now let me provide some more examples here of sort of how unions very narrowly advocated for their own members. Teachers' unions are a very good example, and I know some of you will say that and they'll be like, oh, bad empanada, you hate teachers' unions, why do you think teachers should be enslaved? Obviously, I don't think that. If teachers want to strike, good on them, I guess. Fight for your own pay. Teachers should be paid well. But it is undeniable that when teachers' unions go on strike, attempting to derive benefits for themselves, they harm others. I'm not saying they bear moral responsibility for that, I'm just making a dry statement of fact. If a teachers' union goes on strike, not only do the kids not receive education on that day or those days, but the kids have to stay home, meaning that their parents, most of whom are going to be workers, are going to have to arrange childcare. They're going to have to pay for it. They're going to have to get a family member to help them, which in of itself is labor. That family member might themselves be being taken away from their own labor to do that. Or the parents might have to stay home and take care of their kids and lose a day of pay and potentially, face some sort of repercussions of their job. It's like this domino effect where one group of workers narrowly advocating for their own rights inadvertently, obviously they don't want this to happen, but it nonetheless harms the interests of other workers. And when you think about this exact same logic in regards to imperialism, it's extremely clear how and why unions might advocate for imperialism. Let me give you an example here specifically linked to imperialism. of a union very recently going on strike to attempt to derive better benefits for themselves, and not only potentially harming other workers in their own country, in their own area, but also making it clear that they align totally with the international system of imperialism. So the International Longshoremen's Association, in spite of its name, is a union that mostly represents dock workers in Canada, the US, and Puerto Rico. Not very international. And last year, they held a strike to advocate for the protection of their jobs against automation and improve wages. So this meant they stopped working the docks. This meant international shipping at those ports ground to a halt. Economic activity in those areas was undoubtedly affected, and this undoubtedly had effects on other workers. So that is one way in which a union advocating purely for the narrow interest of its members might not just unambiguously always be a positive thing for everyone. But this could have been a positive thing, at least inadvertently, because if they are not manning the docks anymore, if they're stopping work, that also means that arms shipments would also not be loaded, like arms shipments to Israel, for example, as Israel is currently doing genocide in Gaza. However, the International Longshoremen's Association, duly recognizing how it benefits from complicity in imperialism, how its members benefit from imperialism, specifically made a pledge to handle military cargo during the strike, which also means shipments of arms to Israel. According to a press release by the organization, a spokesman said, dating back to World War I, the ILA was always proud to note that ILA also means love America when it came to its no-strike pledge in handling US military cargo at all its ports. Said ILA President Harold Daggett, who served in the US Navy and saw combat duty during the Vietnam War. We continue our pledge to never let our brave American troops down for their valor and service, and we will proudly continue to work all military shipments beyond October 1st, even if we are engaged in a strike. The ILA's military consultant said, the US government representatives I have been engaging with are very happy and satisfied with the ILA, who have always been there in tough situations and always successfully accomplished the mission. Our US military knows the ILA will conduct military loadout operations even if there is a strike by the ILA. So these guys go on strike but still go to work to load military cargo and just sort of stand around. Like, not to load, for example, food cargo, not anything else, aid, whatever. No, what they have a specific exception for is arms for imperialism. And they speak like imperialists. Like, you heard what I read in that press release. You saw it. This is a clear imperialist union. It's a union whose members and leaders have recognized that for them imperialism is at least neutral and probably even beneficial. Thus, they simply have no incentive to oppose it. So why would they, get bad PR among American imperialists by taking a stand for people who are victims of imperialism by not loading military cargo for the US military and Israel? They have no incentive to do that. Why the hell would you expect them to? I don't expect them to at all. Perfect example of exactly what we're talking about here. So the notion that by attempting to better your own circumstances by joining a union, you might actually be doing something that is not at all conducive to helping others. In fact, you might be harming in your own little way other people who are way worse off than you in the world. It really should not be at all controversial among anyone who considers themselves remotely on the left. And it's incredibly pathetic that a lot of people have this immediate emotional reaction to this notion. None of them attempt a rebuttal. They just sort of say, what? So you want me to die? You want me, a little small bin, to be killed? You want me to suffer? It's either that or they call you white or they just insult you or whatever. There's never really a rebuttal because ultimately what you're saying is true. They kind of know it. It's just they don't want to hear it, in the same way that a Zionist knows that everything you're saying to denounce their ideology is true, but they don't want you to be able to say it. I am very glad that you're being forced to think about this by me and other people who mention this, though, because otherwise, what reason would you have to think about it? None. And then there'd be zero potential for you to even try to do anything about it, instead of just a slight inkling of potential. I know that a lot of people like to live in a sort of comfortable ignorance where all they do is make videos, as this Dead Domain person does, about inconsequential pop culture garbage and abstract concepts, rather than dealing with the real world as it actually exists, and the suffering of the vast majority of people within it. But my channel is, and has always been, dedicated to making you think beyond that. And that will continue. I don't give a shit how many angry rabid first worlders get angry at that and then only get angrier when I refuse to just give in to a mob of idiots insulting me because I'm right. One of the gotchas that these people attempt to throw out when you talk about this sort of thing is, well, what do you expect me to do aside from joining a union? What do you think we should do? You have no solutions. And for one, I'm not really obliged to give you a solution. You know, Karl Marx never really gave you a solution, never really told you much of what to do. And I think that when you are someone who's sort of sitting there and you're aware of these things and you don't even advocate for sort of fighting against them, in fact, if anything, you advocate against fighting against them when you get all angry about this stuff and deny it, I think it's perfectly reasonable to consider you, at least slightly in your own little way, responsible for upholding these systems that hurt people. And I am not obliged to give you some sort of solution to this. If anything, you are the one who should be obliged to work harder to fight against these systems, to at least advocate it against them, to propagandize against them, because by denying what I'm saying, you're doing the exact opposite of that. But for two, there are ways in which you can work to fight this sort of thing. You know, you can think more about little decisions like joining a union, just like how a lot of you recently have started thinking more about little decisions like, is this product that I'm buying in the supermarket Israeli? Little things like that added up can matter. They can make a difference. I'm not saying don't join any union. I'm saying at least think more about the decision. Be conscious about it and be very careful about what you do within a union, because you are ultimately human. You are ultimately gonna follow the carrot on the stick. And the carrot on the stick, when you're in a union in the first world, is often support imperialism. There may be some genuine anti-imperialist unions where you are that are way more involved in broader politics, in broader global geopolitics than other unions are. Look into that maybe. Who knows? At least think about this stuff. You know, stop focusing your politics around unionism, around organized labor in your own country, which is just unionism, really. Start focusing more on imperialism. Stop supporting organizations like Democratic Socialists of America, which, in spite of the good intentions of some of its members, even perhaps a lot of them, ultimately does nothing but Democratic Party entryism, which has been proven to be a dead end time and time again, not just for you guys, but especially for the rest of the world over the course of 50 plus years. At least advocate for working towards to making a legitimate third party, because you guys have ceded, in the US I'm talking about, this is not the case for other countries, but in the US, you guys have ceded the grounds of creating a genuine workers/anti-imperialist party to crackpots. The fact that the American Communist Party, or whatever it's called, led by fucking Infrared Has, the two holes guy, legitimately has like thousands of members now, when the rest of you have been insisting that it's impossible to make a third party for years and years, so don't even try, while doing Democratic Party entryism and electing people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders over and over again, who then, shock, horror, turn out to be stooges for imperialism. Who could have ever seen that coming? You know, they're in the Democratic Party. Whoa! I never would have thought they'd be subsumed by the imperialist structure. Stop doing that sort of thing over and over again. Work on something else. Don't join entryist organizations. Start small, as every third party everywhere does. Work your way up until you have developed a viable alternative. It is possible in the US. Your country is not exceptional. You don't have a special system where this sort of thing is impossible and you're forced to work within the Democratic Party. It's simply not the case. You're engaging in American exceptionalism there, very simply. The fact that you guys have ceded the ground of the third party to crackpots like Infrared Has, like Jackson Hinkle, has led a ton of people who want to engage in building an alternative to the two imperialist parties astray, because they look at the third party space and all that there is that idiotic party, so they join it. It's on you guys that happened. The growth of the ACP is on the DSA. It's on the DSA for misleading people into doing Democratic Party entryism, which never works, instead of anything that even has a slight inkling of potential to inconvenience imperialism. Now, this obviously doesn't go for everyone everywhere. Look at the UK, for example. Genuine anti-imperialists like Zara Sultana and Jeremy Corbyn recently formed their own independent third party in a break from the Labour Party. This is the sort of thing that Americans should have been trying to seriously do for a very long time. You know, you work your way up from the smallest of local levels to the national level over the course of decades. But Americans always prioritize themselves, which is why they do Democratic Party entryism, because it is actually feasible that the Democratic Party could derive benefits for you. What's not really feasible is that they would ever fight imperialism. You know, it's feasible that one day someone like Bernie Sanders or AOC could be instrumental in getting you guys universal healthcare, but it's not feasible they could ever be instrumental in championing a one-state solution in Palestine. Ultimately, as is the case in the US and a lot of the rest of the first world, when the interests of your workers are no longer very aligned with those of people in the imperialized nations, then you need to start looking beyond self-interest. And I unfortunately don't think that many Americans are going to do this, which is why right now a lot of you are advocating for people to vote for fucking Graham Platten, the former Blackwater mercenary. Though it is at least a positive thing that in other countries, in other imperialist nations, people are doing very good work, actually looking beyond their own self-interest and not making excuses for it, as Americans always do. It's ultimately very easy to say something like, well, what do you expect? We have to work within the Democratic Party. It's the best we got. When the people who will be harmed by you saying that and by your subsequent inaction are out of sight and out of mind, as the victims of US imperialism are. And all of this goes right back to what I've been saying here about unions, first world unions, and how you need to think more and perhaps even in some cases, do things that might result in you not deriving as many benefits as you otherwise would have, rather than just lionizing them as like stalwarts of the working class movement. The only thing that unions are the stalwarts of is their own members, and often not even that. Often they're stalwarts just of the state. Now, of course, I'm talking very narrowly here about electoralism because this is the only thing that a lot of people seem to understand. It's also probably the only thing you're actually allowed to speak freely on social media platforms. But obviously, there are things that you can do outside of the electoral system, outside of just trying to form a third party. Palestine Action was a good example of this, but I just told you what you can do aside from that sort of drastic action. So you just don't have the gotcha of, well, what do you expect me to do anymore? But I'm sure, as always happens with Americans who pretend to be on the left, who pretend to be against imperialism, but ultimately just make excuses for taking no action against it, you're going to move on to the next talking point, which is the US is exceptional. Here we can't do the same thing that works literally everywhere else. So yeah, anyway, so that is a thorough little explanation of why I'm right, and all the people who are made uncomfortable by me daring to say something that should really be uncontroversially accepted. And it really should not be controversial at all to say something as so simply true as unions in the first world benefit from imperialism, and thus their members are incentivized to advocate for it too. And the fact that it is reveals a whole lot more about the people who reacted in anger to that notion with insults, with ridiculous strawmans painting themselves as some sort of victim, and stuff like that. And I'm glad to have made them uncomfortable. I will keep doing so. I will never stop.